There is a category of knowledge in security research that almost never becomes public. Not because it is classified, and not because its holders are protective of competitive advantage in any ordinary commercial sense, but because it is, in the most literal way, difficult to articulate. It lives in the gap between what a researcher does and what they can explain about why they do it. Most practitioners who operate at the frontier of vulnerability research cannot fully describe their own methodology. Not from evasion but from the genuine difficulty of rendering tacit knowledge into language. What Alisa Esage published recently in a single YouTube video is therefore unusual. Not because the ideas are unfamiliar to those who work alongside her, but because she found language for them. That alone makes it worth a careful examination. The examination that follows is not a summary of her talk. It is an attempt to draw out the structural argument that underlies her methodology and apply it as a diagnostic, not to any individual researcher's practice, but to the field as a whole. The diagnosis is not comfortable. Security research, as currently practiced across the majority of its professional population, is optimized for the wrong epistemic layer. The consequences of that misalignment are becoming visible now, accelerated by forces that were already in motion before the current generation of AI tools made them impossible to ignore. The surface and what lies beneath. Security research presents itself to the world as a technical discipline. This is accurate but incomplete in a way that matters. The visible surface of the field, CVE disclosures, conference presentations, proof of concept repositories, bug bounty payouts, represents the output of a research process, not the process itself. What produced those outputs remains largely illegible, even to many practitioners inside the field. The methodology lives upstream of the artifact, and the artifact is all that most people ever see. This opacity has consequences. When the artifact is all that is visible, the artifact becomes the model. Researchers learn by studying disclosed vulnerabilities, existing exploits, published techniques. They develop fluency with the known attack surface. They become skilled at recognizing patterns that have already been named. This is not worthless. Pattern recognition built on deep case study is real capability, and Esage herself names case study reverse engineering as a foundational practice. But pattern recognition trained exclusively on the visible record produces a specific and limited kind of researcher. One who is highly effective at rediscovering known vulnerability classes in new targets, and structurally ill-equipped to find anything genuinely novel. The distinction between these two orientations, toward the known or toward the unknown, is not primarily a matter of intelligence or technical depth. It is a matter of what layer of the discipline a researcher has been trained, by habit and incentive, to work at. And most of the incentive structures in contemporary security research point toward the visible layer. Bug bounty programs reward disclosed findings. Conference acceptance committees reward reproducible and communicable results. Hiring pipelines reward demonstrated prior art fluency. None of these are irrational at the individual level. Collectively, they constitute a systematic pressure toward a mode of research that is, by construction, always operating on territory that has already been partially mapped. Esage's methodology is organized around a different orientation. Its foundation is not the known attack surface but a set of practices for constructing models of attack surfaces that do not yet exist as legible artifacts anywhere. Models that must be built from first principles by consuming large quantities of raw material and performing an act of abstraction that converts that material into something with genuine predictive power. The distinction between having read about 100 vulnerabilities and having built an abstract model from them is not trivial. The first produces a catalog. The second produces a map of territory that extends beyond what the catalog contains. This is what makes her framework a systems-level argument rather than a collection of professional habits. She is not describing a more efficient path to the same destination most researchers are headed toward. She is describing a different destination, one that requires a different epistemological posture from the outset. The researcher who has internalized that posture does not experience the question, "Where do I look?" as a function of what has been found before. They experience it as a function of a model that tells them what the target's architecture implies should be findable, independent of whether anyone has found it yet. That gap, between what has been found and what the architecture implies should be findable, is where 0 days live, and it is not accessible from the visible surface of the field. It requires the kind of structural sight that only develops through sustained practice at the level of abstraction most practitioners never reach, not because they lack the capacity, but because nothing in the ordinary incentive landscape of security research rewards the investment required to get there. The field, in this sense, systematically underproduces the capability it most needs, and has done so for long enough that the deficit has become structural rather than incidental. Convergent architecture and the illegible specification. In 2018, Esage did something that seems straightforward in description and is anything but in practice. She studied several major hypervisor implementations in sequence: VirtualBox, Hyper-V, VMware Workstation, Xen, KVM. With the specific intent of building a unified model of the attack surface they collectively represented. What she found surprised her. Across implementations that had been developed independently, by different organizations, with different code bases, different languages, different internal cultures, and crucially without any shared governing specification, the abstract attack surface model was essentially the same. The same classes of boundary violations, the same categories of trust assumptions, the same structural positions where the interface between guest and host created conditions that an attacker could reason about in consistent ways. This is a remarkable observation and it deserves more analytical weight than it typically receives when researchers encounter it. Hypervisors are not like web browsers or JavaScript engines, where a published specification, however incomplete on implementation details, provides a skeletal common architecture that independent implementations are at least notionally building toward. There is no hypervisor specification in that sense. The virtualization industry grew organically from a handful of foundational papers, accumulated engineering practice, and hardware capabilities that evolved in parallel with the software attempting to exploit them. VMware's early work, the Popek and Goldberg formalization of virtual machine requirements, Intel VTX and AMD as they arrived, these steered the field without prescribing it. Every major hypervisor is, at the architectural level, an independent invention that happened to be solving the same underlying problem under the same hardware constraints. And yet the abstract attack surface converges. The question worth asking is why? The answer is that security-relevant architectural structure is not primarily a function of design decisions. It is a function of the problem itself, of what a hypervisor is required to do, at the level of hardware interaction, privilege separation, and guest-host interface management, in order to function at all. The attack surface that emerges from those requirements is not arbitrary. It is constrained by physics, by the ISA, by the demands of the workloads being virtualized. Developers making independent implementation choices under those constraints will, if they are solving the problem correctly, arrive at structurally similar positions. And structurally similar positions create structurally similar attack surfaces. The convergence is not coincidental. It is the shape of the solution space. The implication for security research is significant and underappreciated. If attack surfaces are convergent across implementations of the same class, then the correct unit of analysis for a researcher is not the implementation, it is the class. A researcher who has built a genuine abstract model of the hypervisor attack surface has not produced knowledge that applies to VirtualBox. They have produced knowledge that applies to every current and future hypervisor, weighted by the degree to which any given implementation's peculiarities cause it to deviate from the class norm. The model has, in Esage's formulation, a large transfer radius. It moves across implementations, across time, across the natural churn of the software landscape in ways that implementation-specific knowledge cannot. This is the mechanism by which depth compounds and breadth does not. A researcher who has spent a year developing exhaustive knowledge of VirtualBox's specific codebase has produced capability that is largely non-transferable when VirtualBox is patched, superseded, or simply no longer the relevant target. A researcher who has spent the same year building an abstract model of the hypervisor class from VirtualBox and 4 of its peers has produced something that appreciates rather than depreciates. Because every new hypervisor implementation that appears is now legible to them in a way, it is not legible to someone who studied only the surface of existing implementations. The same logic extends beyond hypervisors. JavaScript engines present a different case. Specifications exist, as Esage notes, but the specifications silence on optimization pipelines, JIT compilation architecture, and the specific implementation choices that govern how those systems interact with the memory model means that the attack surface relevant to practical exploitation is almost entirely in the unspecified space. Browser vendors are not constrained by the ECMA script specification in how they implement speculative optimization. They are constrained by performance requirements and hardware realities, which means, again, that convergence emerges from the problem rather than from the document. The abstract model built from studying V8, Spider Monkey, and JavaScript core in sequence is not a synthesis of 3 codebases. It is a map of the territory that all 3 are navigating. What makes this mode of analysis difficult is precisely what makes it powerful. Building the abstract model requires consuming a volume of material, hundreds of vulnerability disclosures, specifications, architectural documentation, implementation source. That resists the kind of structured decomposition most researchers are trained to apply. The model is not extracted from any single source. It emerges from a process of comparison and reduction that requires holding many specific instances in mind simultaneously and performing an act of synthesis that cannot be reduced to a procedure. It is, in the most precise sense, a creative act, one that produces an artifact with no prior existence, that cannot be copied from any available reference. And that constitutes genuine intellectual property in the researcher who built it. This is also why it cannot be automated, not yet, and not in any near-term configuration of current AI tooling. Large language models are extraordinarily capable at working within known attack surface territory. They can identify known vulnerability patterns in new code, suggest known exploitation techniques for known bug classes, and accelerate the mechanical aspects of analysis at a pace that has already transformed what a single researcher can accomplish in a working day. What they cannot do is perform the synthesis that produces the abstract model in the first place. Because that synthesis depends on a form of reasoning about structural constraint and convergent implication that requires the kind of grounded understanding of why implementations are the way they are that current models do not possess. They know what hypervisors look like from the outside. They do not know why they look that way. That distinction between surface familiarity and structural understanding is the same distinction that separates the 2 kinds of researcher this article is diagnosing. And as Section IV will argue, it is precisely the boundary along which the current displacement event in security research is cutting. Reading the breadcrumb trail. Every piece of software that has been exposed to an adversarial environment for long enough carries within its public vulnerability history a record of something more than its past failures. It carries a record of the successive states of a contest between the structural properties of the implementation and the evolving capability of the researchers and attackers who have engaged with it. That contest leaves a pattern. The pattern is readable, and reading it correctly is one of the more underutilized strategic capabilities in offensive security research. Esage describes this heuristic briefly, almost in passing, as a 5-minute exercise. Open the vulnerability list, read the bug classes and affected subsystems. Form a judgment about where the target currently sits in its hardening lifecycle. The compression is characteristic of someone for whom the underlying model is so thoroughly internalized that its application feels trivial. The model itself is not trivial. Unpacking it is worth the effort. The hardening process in mature software is not uniform and it is not shallow. It does not proceed by random discovery and random remediation across the entire attack surface simultaneously. It proceeds by exposure. A class of vulnerability becomes visible to the research community, either through a high-profile disclosure or through the accumulation of related findings. And the target organization responds. The response is never total. Patching a specific instance of a vulnerability class does not eliminate the class. It raises the cost of exploitation within that class, shifts attention toward adjacent territory, and leaves the deeper architectural conditions that permitted the class in the first place largely intact unless the response includes structural remediation, which it frequently does not. Because structural remediation is expensive, and the immediate pressure is to close the specific disclosed finding. What this means in practice is that vulnerability history is a record of which parts of the attack surface have been under sustained adversarial pressure and which have not. A subsystem that appears repeatedly across a target's CVE history is a subsystem that has been found, examined, partially hardened, and found again, which tells a researcher several things simultaneously. It tells them that the subsystem's architectural position makes it structurally attractive to attackers. It tells them that prior hardening has not resolved the underlying conditions. And it tells them that the current state of that subsystem, while more defended than it was before the most recent disclosure, is likely to contain residual vulnerability in the form of incomplete fixes, adjacent code paths that received less scrutiny than the disclosed location, and in some cases new attack surface introduced by the remediation itself, a phenomenon sufficiently common to have generated its own research literature. A subsystem that does not appear in the vulnerability history is a different kind of signal, and a more ambiguous one. Absence from the public record could indicate genuine security, a subsystem that has been designed and implemented with sufficient care that it has resisted sustained adversarial attention. It could also indicate obscurity, a subsystem that has not yet attracted the research attention that would expose its weaknesses. Distinguishing between these two interpretations requires the abstract model of the class, which is why the hardening heuristic and the attack surface model are not independent tools but components of the same analytical system. The class model tells you what the architecture implies should be present. The vulnerability history tells you what has actually been found. The gap between those two accounts is where the most interesting research questions live. The history of Chrome's memory safety evolution illustrates the heuristic in concrete terms. The browser's public vulnerability record through the mid-2010s was dominated by heap corruption, use after free conditions in particular, concentrated in the rendering engine and the DOM implementation. The research community's sustained engagement with those classes, combined with Google's internal response, produced a hardening trajectory that included incremental compiler mitigations, partition allocation changes, and eventually the broader shift toward memory-safe components that characterizes the current architecture. Each stage of that trajectory is visible in the CVE record as a shift in the distribution of bug classes, fewer classic heap corruptions, more findings in the JIT compiler, in IPC boundaries, in the renderer browser privilege separation layer. A researcher reading that distribution in, say, 2019 and asking where the productive research territory lay was not facing an open question. The hardening state of the known attack surface was broadcasting an answer, not with certainty, but with enough signal to make a strategic judgment about where to invest research time. The same logic applied to the hypervisor space following the Spectre and Meltdown disclosures of 2018. The vulnerability history before that period was concentrated in device emulation. The virtual device stack that handles guest I/O presented a large and relatively accessible attack surface that yielded consistent findings across multiple implementations. The post-disclosure period saw a visible shift in research attention and vendor hardening toward the speculative execution boundary and the memory subsystem. A researcher entering the space in 2020 and reading the prior 4 years of CVE history was reading a document that described, with considerable specificity, which parts of the hypervisor attack surface had been under the heaviest adversarial pressure, which mitigations had been applied and where their edges were, and which subsystems had received comparatively less attention as the community concentrated on the speculative execution problem. That is strategic intelligence. It is available to anyone willing to develop the model required to read it. The practical constraint is significant. The signal is not in the CVE descriptions themselves, which have become progressively less technically informative over time as disclosure norms have shifted toward withholding implementation details during patch windows and, increasingly, thereafter. The signal is in the pattern, in the subsystem distribution, the bug class distribution, the temporal clustering of related findings, and the relationship between what is disclosed and what the abstract class model predicts should exist. Extracting that signal requires the class model as a prior. Without it, the vulnerability history is a list. With it, the vulnerability history is a map of contested territory, annotated with information about which positions have been fortified and which remain exposed. This is what Esage means when she describes the hardening breadcrumb trail as a strategic tool rather than a historical record. The trail does not tell you where bugs were. It tells you, to a researcher equipped with the right interpretive framework, where bugs are most likely to be now, which classes are most likely to yield, which subsystems warrant the deepest attention, and which tools and techniques are most likely to be productive given the current hardening state of the target. That is the kind of foresight that separates a research program organized around strategic judgment from one organized around exhaustive enumeration of the known attack surface. The former is working with a map. The latter is walking the territory blind and hoping to stumble onto something the map would have shown them directly. The compression problem. Something is happening to the knowledge layer of security research that has no precise historical parallel, though it has approximate analogies in other fields that underwent rapid mechanization of their core cognitive tasks. The analogy is imperfect in ways that matter, but the structural dynamic is recognizable. A body of knowledge that previously required years of accumulated practice to develop fluency with is becoming accessible, in increasingly capable approximate form, to anyone with access to the right tool and the ability to ask a productive question. The consequences of that shift are not evenly distributed across the population of practitioners it affects. For those whose capability is substantially constituted by that knowledge layer, the consequences are severe. For those whose capability sits above it, who use the knowledge layer as raw material for something the tool cannot yet perform, the same shift is a straightforward productivity gain. Esage states this directly: AI will replace shallow practitioners and give the top tier a boost. The observation is correct, but the framing, in its brevity, understates what is actually occurring. This is not primarily a story about individual career trajectories. It is a story about an epistemological event in the structure of a discipline, one that is reorganizing what security research is, at the level of what the field's productive outputs actually require from the humans performing them. The knowledge that current AI tooling compresses most effectively is pattern-based, corpus-derived, and bounded by prior disclosure. These are precisely the characteristics that define the visible layer of security research, the CVEs, the conference presentations, the published exploit techniques, the documented attack classes. A language model trained on that corpus has absorbed, in some functional sense, the accumulated public knowledge of the field. It can identify known vulnerability patterns in unfamiliar code with a speed and coverage no individual researcher can match. It can suggest exploitation approaches for known bug classes, generate fuzzing harnesses tuned to known attack surfaces, and perform the mechanical triage of large code bases that previously consumed a significant fraction of a researcher's working time. These are not trivial capabilities. They represent a genuine compression of the entry cost to competent pattern matching research, the kind of research that finds the next instance of a known class in a new target. What this means for the distribution of research output is that the known attack surface is being covered faster and more thoroughly than it has ever been covered before. Every known vulnerability class is being searched for in every accessible codebase by a combination of human researchers and AI-augmented tooling that, collectively, constitutes a more comprehensive and more rapid enumeration of the known territory than the field has previously been capable of. The competitive value of being skilled at finding known classes in new code is therefore declining, not because the skill has become less technically demanding, but because the relative scarcity of researchers capable of it, which previously sustained its value, is being eroded by the availability of tooling that performs an adequate approximation of the same function at marginal cost. This dynamic does not touch the abstract layer in the same way. The synthesis that produces a genuine attack surface model, the kind Esage describes building for the hypervisor class from hundreds of vulnerability case studies and multiple implementation analyses, is not a pattern matching operation over a fixed corpus. It is a generative act that produces knowledge not already present in any form in the training data. The model of the hypervisor attack surface that Esage carries is not latent in any collection of CVE descriptions or conference papers, waiting to be extracted by a sufficiently capable retrieval system. It was built by a process of comparison, reduction, and structural reasoning that required understanding not just what vulnerabilities have been found, but why the architecture that produced them is the way it is, and what that implies about territory that has not yet been explored. Current AI tooling is not performing that operation. It is performing a sophisticated and increasingly capable version of retrieval and pattern application over a fixed knowledge boundary. The boundary is the edge of what has been publicly disclosed and what can be structurally inferred from that disclosure by the kind of statistical reasoning large language models apply. Beyond that boundary, in the territory that a genuine abstract model illuminates, but that the public record does not describe, the tool has no purchase. It can tell you what is known. It cannot tell you what the architecture implies should exist but hasn't been found yet. That remains the exclusive output of the kind of structural reasoning that the abstract modeling practice is designed to develop. The consequence is a redistribution of research value that is already underway and will accelerate. The known attack surface is becoming a commodity, not immediately, not uniformly, and not without considerable residual value in the hands of practitioners who can apply AI tooling with genuine technical sophistication. But the direction is clear. Research value is migrating toward the production of novel attack surface knowledge, toward findings that extend the map rather than enumerate the known territory more efficiently. And the production of novel attack surface knowledge requires precisely the abstract modeling capability, the hardening state reading, and the novelty-optimized research orientation that constitute the upper layer of Esage's methodology. There is a further compression dynamic that is less frequently discussed. AI tooling does not merely accelerate the search of known attack surfaces. It accelerates the publication and propagation of findings within them. A vulnerability class that might previously have taken 2 or 3 years to be fully worked through the research community, as practitioners independently discovered, exploited, disclosed, and built on each other's work, can now move through that cycle substantially faster. The public record that constitutes the training boundary for the next generation of tooling is therefore being populated faster. The compression is self-reinforcing. Faster enumeration of the known surface produces faster enrichment of the corpus, which produces more capable tooling for the next round of enumeration. The known territory is being colonized at an accelerating rate. What this leaves, at the edge of that expanding territory, is a margin where the tooling runs out, where the corpus thins, where the pattern matching has nothing to match against, where the structural reasoning that produces novel insight has no mechanical substitute. That margin is not shrinking. It is, if anything, becoming more distinct as the interior of the known territory becomes more thoroughly mapped. It is also becoming more consequential, because the findings that emerge from that margin are findings that no automated enumeration of the known surface would have produced. Which means they are findings that represent genuine intelligence advantages for whoever holds them. In a field where the value of a 0 day is substantially constituted by its non-existence in any adversary's possession, the migration of research value toward the novel margin is not an abstraction. It is a material shift in where the most consequential work is being done and by whom. Esage's observation that she has been operating at this margin for a decade, not because she anticipated the current AI displacement event, but because novelty optimization and abstract modeling were simply the most productive research orientations available to her, is not a statement about foresight. It is a statement about the natural convergence between deep methodological discipline and the territory that discipline reveals. The margin was always where the most interesting work was. The current moment has made that structurally legible to the rest of the field in a way it was not before. For practitioners who built their capability at the surface layer, that legibility arrives as a crisis. For those who built it at the abstract layer, it arrives as confirmation. The infrastructure of productive uncertainty. There is a category of professional failure in security research that does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a single visible collapse, a missed deadline, a failed engagement, a public retraction. It accumulates invisibly, in the progressive degradation of the capacity for the kind of sustained, high-complexity cognitive work that the abstract layer of research requires. Until the researcher finds themselves able to perform the mechanical functions of their role while no longer able to perform its generative ones. They can still read code. They can still operate the tools. They can no longer build the models. The failure is epistemic before it is operational, and by the time it becomes operational, it has usually been underway for long enough that its causes are difficult to attribute accurately. Esage addresses this directly, and the inclusion of CNS regulation and biochemical self-management in a methodology talk about vulnerability research is not a digression. It is a recognition that the kind of work she is describing, sustained operation at the abstract layer, under conditions of high uncertainty, against problems that resist resolution on any comfortable timescale, places demands on the human system performing it that the human system was not designed to meet indefinitely without active management. The failure modes are real, they are common, and they are almost entirely absent from public discussion of what security research practice actually requires. The adenosine mechanism she describes is worth taking seriously as more than biohacking detail. ATP consumption during high-complexity cognitive work produces adenosine as a metabolic byproduct. Adenosine accumulates faster than it clears during sustained intellectual effort. As it accumulates, it acts as a progressive inhibitor of neural activity, a built-in circuit breaker that the brain deploys against the metabolic stress of extended high-intensity processing. Caffeine suppresses the signal without clearing the molecule, which means the apparent removal of the constraint is illusory. The adenosine continues to accumulate behind the pharmacological block, and its effects are deferred rather than resolved. Sleep clears adenosine through specific molecular pathways that require adequate duration to complete, which means truncated sleep not only fails to restore baseline capacity, but compounds the deficit from the previous day's accumulation. The magnesium dependency of the clearance pathway means that even researchers who manage caffeine intake and sleep duration correctly face a depletion bottleneck that dietary intake alone is generally insufficient to address under sustained high-complexity workloads. None of this is speculative. The biochemistry is well established. What is unusual is finding it presented as a component of a security research methodology. And what that placement reveals is a level of systematic self-observation that is itself a methodological commitment. Esage is not describing these mechanisms because she read about them in a wellness context and found them applicable. She is describing them because she tracked her own performance degradation to its sources with the same analytical discipline she applies to the systems she researches. Built a model of the mechanism, identified the intervention points, and engineered solutions that address the underlying dynamic rather than masking its symptoms. The same cognitive posture that produces abstract attack surface models produces, when turned inward, a functional model of the researcher's own operational constraints. This matters because the work that lives at the abstract layer is uniquely vulnerable to the degradation that unmanaged cognitive load produces. Pattern matching research, the search for known classes in new code, is to a significant degree robust to moderate cognitive impairment. The patterns are externally defined. The tools provide scaffolding. A researcher operating at reduced capacity can still run a fuzzer, still triage crash reports, still apply known techniques to known surfaces. The work suffers in quality and speed, but it does not stop being possible. Abstract modeling does not have that resilience. The synthesis that produces a genuine class model requires the full capacity of the cognitive system performing it, the ability to hold multiple complex representations simultaneously. To perform the reduction that isolates structural invariance from implementation noise, to reason about implication and constraint across a large and loosely organized body of material. That capacity is precisely what adenosine accumulation, chronic sleep deficit, and unmanaged cognitive overload degrade first and most severely. The infrastructure that Esage describes building around her research practice, the R&D platform investment, the time boxing and scope containment, the biochemical management, is therefore not peripheral to the methodology. It is the methodology's precondition. Without it, the abstract layer is inaccessible, not because the researcher lacks the intellectual capability to operate there, but because the conditions required to exercise that capability have been eroded by the cumulative friction of an unmanaged research environment. The R&D platform argument makes this concrete at the operational level. The common pattern among researchers approaching a new target is to engage it directly with whatever tooling is immediately available, existing builds, generic debug configurations, whatever the public repository provides. The friction this generates is not merely inconvenient. It is cognitively expensive in a specific way. Every interruption to research flow caused by an inadequate platform, a missing debug symbol, an uninstrumented binary that silently absorbs the bug being tested, a configuration that has to be reconstructed from memory each session, is not simply a time cost. It is a context-switching cost that falls disproportionately on the kind of sustained, low-distraction cognitive state that abstract modeling requires. The researcher who spends 2 days at the outset of a project building a proper platform, instrumented self-build, debugger attached, cross-referenced ID, documented launch configurations, is not being cautious or methodical at the expense of momentum. They are protecting the cognitive conditions under which the most productive work will subsequently occur. The time boxing practice operates on a different but related principle. Security research at the frontier is structurally open-ended in a way that most professional cognitive work is not. There is no natural completion boundary, no external signal that the problem has been sufficiently explored. No feedback mechanism that tells the researcher when to stop looking in a given direction and redirect. In the absence of imposed boundaries, this openness becomes a source of the particular kind of cognitive drain that comes not from intense focused effort but from sustained low-grade uncertainty. The background processing load of a problem that is always present, never resolved, and continuously recruiting attentional resources from whatever else the researcher is attempting to do. Esage's practice of giving herself 1 month to find a 0 day in a new system from scratch is not an arbitrary productivity technique. It is a structural response to the specific psychological topology of frontier research, the imposition of a completion condition on a domain that does not naturally supply one, which has the effect of converting open-ended uncertainty into bounded effort with a defined terminus. What unites these practices, the biochemical management, the platform investment, the time containment, is a common recognition that the cognitive resource required for abstract layer research is finite, depletable, and unevenly distributed across the researcher's working life depending on conditions that are substantially within their control. Most professional frameworks for security research treat the researcher as a constant, a fixed capability that produces output as a function of the tools and targets made available to it. Esage's methodology treats the researcher as a variable, a system with its own architecture, its own attack surfaces, its own hardening requirements, and applies to that system the same analytical discipline it applies to the software being researched. The methodology is, in this sense, recursive. It models the modeler. What this costs and who can afford it. The methodology Esage describes is real. Its effectiveness is not in serious question. Her public track record across browsers, hypervisors, and hardened embedded systems constitutes an existence proof that the approach produces results at the highest level of difficulty the field presents. The analytical framework developed across the preceding sections of this article has attempted to show why it works, because it operates at the layer where genuine novel knowledge is produced, rather than the layer where existing knowledge is applied to new instances of known problems. That argument stands. What it does not address, and what a diagnosis of the field's current condition requires addressing, is the question of what the methodology's prerequisites actually are and how evenly they are distributed across the population of practitioners who might in principle adopt it. The answer is not encouraging, and stating it plainly is more useful than allowing it to remain implicit. Building a genuine abstract attack surface model from first principles requires, as a baseline, the prior consumption of an enormous volume of technical material. Esage describes reverse engineering hundreds of vulnerabilities, studying multiple complete implementations of a target class, absorbing specifications and architectural documentation across a sustained period before the synthesis that produces the model becomes possible. This is not a weekend project. It is not a course. It is not something that can be telescoped by access to better tooling, including AI tooling, because, as Section IV argued, the synthesis itself is precisely the operation that current AI cannot perform, which means the human performing it cannot offload the generative work to an automated system. They can offload the preparation. The synthesis remains theirs to do, and it requires the full prior investment in raw material before it becomes possible. That investment has a cost that is denominated not primarily in money but in time and in the structural conditions that make sustained deep study possible. A researcher who is carrying a high consulting load, managing client deliverables on short cycles, or operating under the financial pressure that makes any extended period of non-billable research investment difficult to justify is not well positioned to make that investment. Not because they lack the capability, but because the conditions required to exercise it are not available to them. The abstract modeling practice that Esage describes developing over a decade was developed, in part, under conditions that permitted that development. Conditions that include not only the intellectual orientation to pursue depth over breadth, but the structural circumstances that make sustained depth-oriented research economically survivable. The R&D platform investment makes this concrete. 2 days to a week of setup time before engaging a new target is, by the standards of independent research practice, a reasonable investment. By the standards of a contracted engagement with a defined scope and a client expecting deliverables, it is a significant friction cost that most engagement models do not naturally accommodate. The self-built instrumented binary, the properly configured debugger environment, the documented toolchain, these are not luxuries, as Esage correctly argues. They are preconditions for the kind of research that finds things generic tooling misses. But they require a research context that treats setup as legitimate investment rather than delay, and not all research contexts do. The biochemical management practice carries a similar implication. Regulating adenosine accumulation through sleep scheduling, managing cognitive load through deliberate scope containment, supplementing the specific micronutrient depletions that sustained high-complexity intellectual work produces. These require a level of systematic self-observation and a degree of control over one's working schedule that is not uniformly available. A researcher working multiple jobs, managing caregiving responsibilities, or operating under the kind of chronic background stress that redistributes attentional resources away from the kind of reflective self-monitoring Esage describes is not failing to implement these practices through negligence or lack of discipline. They are operating under structural constraints that make the practices difficult to implement regardless of whether they understand their importance. None of this is an argument against the methodology. It is an argument about what the methodology reveals when examined not only as a technical framework but as a social artifact, a description of practice that carries, embedded within it, information about the conditions under which that practice is possible. Those conditions are not equally distributed. They correlate, with uncomfortable directness, with the structural advantages that determine who enters the field, who survives the early years of low-margin research investment, and who arrives at a position from which the decade-long project of building genuine abstract modeling capability becomes a viable allocation of professional time. The field's current AI displacement moment makes this structural inequality more consequential, not less. If the compression dynamic described in section IV is correct, if the known attack surface is becoming a commodity and research value is migrating toward the novel margin, then the practitioners who are best positioned to operate at that margin are those who have already made the investment that abstract modeling requires. Those practitioners are not a random sample of the security research population. They are, systematically, the practitioners who had access to the structural conditions that made the investment survivable. The displacement event is not only reorganizing what the field values. It is, in the absence of deliberate countermeasures, reorganizing who the field values it from, and the reorganization is not in the direction of broader access. This is the dimension of Esage's methodology that deserves more attention than it typically receives when her work is discussed in the contexts where it is discussed at all, which is to say, primarily among practitioners who are already operating at or near the level she describes, for whom the methodology functions as confirmation and refinement rather than as a distant aspiration. The structural argument she is making, beneath the technical one, is that the field has a layer of practice that is both more productive and more defensible than the layer most practitioners occupy, and that the gap between those layers is not primarily a function of intelligence or technical talent but of the accumulated investment that operating at the higher layer requires. That is a valuable observation. It is also, stated plainly, a description of a moat, one that compounds over time, that AI displacement is deepening rather than filling, and that the field has no current structural mechanism for helping practitioners cross. What would such a mechanism look like is a question this article does not have space to answer adequately, and that the field has not yet seriously asked. Mentorship structures that transmit abstract modeling practice directly, rather than leaving it to be independently rediscovered by each generation of researchers who survive long enough and work in contexts permissive enough to develop it, would be a beginning. Research funding models that treat the non-billable investment period of platform setup, case study consumption, and model construction as legitimate cost rather than overhead would be another. Neither is straightforwardly available within the current institutional landscape of security research, which remains organized primarily around deliverable-based engagement models that systematically discount exactly the kind of investment the methodology requires. What is available, immediately and without institutional change, is the clarity that a framework like Esage's provides about what the investment actually consists of. Most practitioners who have not made it do not know precisely what they have not made, because the abstract layer of the field is, as this article's opening observed, largely illegible from the surface. Esage has made it somewhat more legible. That is not a small contribution. Legibility is the precondition for any deliberate effort to close the gap, at the individual level, at the institutional level, and at the level of a field that has a structural interest in ensuring that the most consequential security research is not permanently concentrated in the hands of the few practitioners who happened to develop, under the right conditions, the right epistemic habits at the right time. The abstraction advantage is real. The question the field has not yet answered is whether it intends to remain a private one. Jonathan Brown, Border Cybergroup, bordercybergroup.com. Support independent security journalism.